Hey guys, welcome to the first lesson on fundamentals of C# programming. Today we're going to be talking about how we work with data in C#. We'll talk about how we use variables and how we declare them. We'll talk about how we use arithmetic operators to do things like adding and subtracting. We'll talk about how we use a console to build applications. And then we'll finish by building a simple console calculator application. So let's get started. So before I go into what it requires to build a variable, these are three basic variable declarations. Variables are just ways that we can store data or information. Variables are simply just named storage locations. They're just storage locations that have a name attached to it so that we can access that location easy. Um, the first thing of building a variable is its data type. Its data type specifies what kind of information is going to be stored into that variable. Um, Microsoft supplies us with basic intrinsic data types by default. So we can look at those. Here's a list of them. Here of these, the most common ones that we'll be using are integers, which are right here, doubles, bools, strings, and objects. Integers, which is the first one, can hold whole numbers. They hold, you can see that the largest value and the smallest value is its range of whole numbers. You can also see that it says it's signed. Signed means that it can hold positive or negative numbers, whereas unsigned means that it can only hold positive numbers. You can see with the unsigned variables or data types, um, the smallest value is 0 because it can't be negative. So 0 is the smallest positive number. So that's integers. Doubles can hold decimal point values, and they have its own range. And that can hold decimal point values um, like 5.5, for instance. You also can see its memory that each data type requires. So a double requires 8 bytes of memory, an integer requires 4 bytes of memory, and so on. Bools hold either true or false values. Only true or false. That's the only thing it can hold. A true or false. Strings can hold text. So if we have like the word hello, we can store that into a string. It's text, and we use double quotes with that, but I'll get to that eventually. So yeah, strings can hold text, and then objects we'll get to eventually also. So here are a couple variable declarations. So let's just work with the first one to start off. So the first thing in declaring a variable is its data type. So as you can see here, we're using integers. An int can hold a whole number. So we're saying int, then followed by the variable's name or identifier, how we talk to that variable location or access it. So we're saying that this variable location is going to be called my age. Then we say my age is equal to a value. The equal to is the assignment operator. The assignment operator takes the value on the right and assigns it to whatever is on the left of it. So this is saying take 50 and put it into my age. And then the last thing in the variable is a semicolon. The semicolon is like a line terminator. It says that this statement is done, and it shows us that this is a statement. So yeah, that's a variable of type integer. Here's a variable of type double. A double can hold a decimal point, so you can see that our variable is holding at 5.5. We called our double my money. Now, just to show you, if I were to try to store a decimal into an integer, I'm going to get a compile time error. And that's because a double has a decimal point and an integer cannot hold decimals, and it only can hold whole numbers. So it gets an error. If I highlight that error, you'll see that it says that it can't convert type double to int. And that's because by default, any decimal point number is a double. So it's trying to convert this double to an integer to store it in this variable, but it can't do that. There is, however, a way to force that to fit into an integer, but we do lose some things, and I'll talk about that. It's called casting, and you can see in the error at the end of the tooltip, it says, "Are you missing a cast?" So that just kind of shows you that we can still do it somehow, but we have to use casting. So I'll take that out. So and then the last variable I have here is a string, and you can see a string is simply just text. We have our variable's name, which is my name, and then we have it equal to our text. This is called a literal constant, meaning because it's actually right there. All these are called literals. 50, 5.5, and Frank in double quotes are literals because they're hard coded in. They're right there. Strings, when you make a string, it requires double quotes. That shows that it's a string. So whenever you have a literal string, you put it around double quotes. So we say string my name equals Frank in double quotes followed by a semicolon to show that it's a statement. So let me delete these. So now let's go ahead and work with displaying it into the console. The console is a class that Microsoft supplied for us. They already designed it and coded it, and now we can just use it. So to use it, we first start typing console, followed by a dot. The dot is an operator. It's called the member operator or the member access operator, and it allows us to access members of this class. We'll talk about classes in later lessons, but just for now, realize that console is a class. And to access things of that class, we have to use the dot. So we say console dot, and now we can use functions or other things in there. We'll get to functions, we'll get to all that eventually, but just for now, just realize these things and just copy them. So the first function I want to explain is the writeLine function. We know it's a function because it requires, it has parentheses. Parentheses, if we see parentheses, we should say, oh, that's a function. It performs an action. Functions perform actions. They do something. So this function, in order to do its job, it's saying it requires something. It requires something to be passed into it. So we're going to supply it with one of our variables. We'll say my age, followed by a semicolon to show that it's a statement. So we're saying console.writeLine my age inside its parentheses. The parentheses are its arguments. It's saying that in order for the console.writeLine function to do its job, it needs us to give it something, and we gave it an integer called my age. Let me just run it before explaining more, and you can see when I run it, it prints to the console the number 50, which is exactly what it should have done. My age is a variable that has the value of 50 stored into it. Now, I can also print another variable. I'll print my money, which should say 5.5, and then I'll also print my name, which should print Frank. So let's run that. And you can see that's exactly what it did. It printed 50, then 5.5, and then Frank. Now, there's also another function inside of the console class that prints stuff to the console window, and that's the write function. So if I were to go console.write my age, followed by write my money, followed by write my name, and I ran this, before I explain what write does, I just want to show you what it looks like. So as you can see, it all printed to the same line, 50, 5.5, and Frank. By just using console.write, rather than using writeLine prints what you want and then goes to the next line for the next function to print what it wants. Write just prints what it wants on its current line, and then that's it. When something else comes along, the next thing prints on the same exact line. So that's why by using writes, everything goes on the same line. Whereas let's say if I make one of these write line instead, and then run the program, 50 is written on the first line, then that function, then the write line function puts it to the next line, then it goes count.write my money, which prints 5.5, which doesn't have the right line, so it stays on the same line, and then it prints Frank after. So that's the difference between write line and write. So I'm going to go ahead and add write line back and run it one more time, and you can see what it looks like: 50, 5.5, and Frank. So now let's talk about writing multiple things in one console.write line. So there's a couple methods of doing this, but the first one I'm going to show you is by using the placeholder method. So before I show you the placeholder method, I just want to explain something in programming. So in programming, when we normally deal with counting and we count from something, normally it always starts out with 0 first. So if we wanted to start counting, it would be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, rather than starting normally with 1 and saying 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 0 in programming is normally the first or the first starting point. So that's important for our placeholder method. Now, another thing to realize is if we want to, our placeholder method uses strings. So when we start writing to our console with the string, so for instance, instead of explaining it, let me just start doing it. So let's say console.writeLine, and let's say I want to print out the value that's stored into my money. But I want to add a little message to it instead of just saying my money. So let's start writing and say the money is, then let's add a $sign. And now after we say the money is, we want to then place the value of my money after this $sign. So I'm going to first just write the code and then I'll go back and explain it. So I'm just going to add this real fast and then I'll explain it after. Okay, so the placeholder method is this. You can see this is our placeholder. Like I said, when you count in C# or most programming languages, you always start out with 0 first. So we're saying this is our first placeholder. So in text, in double quotes, this is our literal string. This is what's going to be printed. We're saying replace this component, our placeholder, with the first thing that follows after our comma. So we have a comma, then a variable, our name location. And we're saying this value, whatever stored into my money, is going to be stored in the first placeholder location. So you can see that. Now, if I run the program, you can see exactly what happens. It says the money is $sign, then our placeholder, 5.5. That's simply just my money being replaced into there. Yeah. So let's say I wanted to add another thing. Let's say the money is this, and my name is, and then another placeholder. So if we want a second placeholder, we have to use 1. 1 represents our second placeholder. It could go 0, 1, 2 rather than 1, 2, 3. So 0, 1 is our second placeholder, and that's going to be placed in whatever is after the second comma. So we'll do another comma after this, and we'll put in my name. So now my money will be placed in with the first placeholder. My name will be placed in with the second placeholder. Let's run this again. And you can see that's exactly what happened. My money is 5.5, and my name is Frank. So Frank was placed in this placeholder. Alright, for the last one, let's display my age. And let's just say, and my name is this, and I am placeholder years old. So this placeholder, which is our last placeholder, is a 2, and that's because 0, 1, 2 is our third placeholder. So whatever is our third thing after the third comma is going to be placed into that placeholder. So I'll say my age. So let's run this again. And now you can see it all. The money is 5.5, and my name is Frank, and I'm 50 years old. So each variable got placed into its placeholder. Alright, so this is just a basic way of writing to the console using the placeholder method. There is another method of doing this, but I will explain that in later lessons. But we can use this method because consoles are considered formatted by default. And in order to use the placeholder method, we need formatted strings. So let's move on. Let's start talking about arithmetic operators. So arithmetic operators are simply just ways that we can add and subtract. The list of arithmetic operators that we have are we can add, subtract, multiply, divide, and we have a modulus operator, which I'll talk about last. So let's start off with declaring a variable called x. Say int x equals 5. Let's say we have another one called int y. Now, I didn't explain this yet, but when I declare a variable, I don't have to specify a value right away. I can say int y, and then later in my program, I can specify the value of that then. I don't have to specify it right away. But before I start using it, I should specify a value for it. So I could, for instance, later on go y equals 6 down here. It doesn't have to be on the same line. So that's just one thing to note. So let's go back and let's say we have int y equals something. Let's use our plus operator. Let's say int y equals x, whatever the value of x has, plus 5. So I'm saying y is going to be x plus 5. So we know y is going to be 10 because x is 5 plus 5. And that's how the plus works. It's pretty simple. We can make another variable called int z equals y, or no, let's go x minus 5. So now z will be 0. So let's just display these all to the console just so we can see what it looks like. Start with x, then we'll print y, and then followed by z. So let's run that. So you can see the output is 5 for the x, 10 for the y, because 5 plus 5 is 10, and then 0 for the z, because 5 minus 5 is 0. Let's go ahead and practice using our placeholder method and just add a little bit to this. So let's say the value of x is, then a space, then our placeholder will go here. So let's put a space, placeholder, and then comma x. So this is our first console.write line. It will take the value of x, put into our placeholder. Let's do this again. I'm just going to copy and paste this just because it's a little bit easier. X, y, and z. So now let's go ahead and run this again using our placeholders. And now you can see a little bit better. The value of x is 5, the value of y is 10, and the value of z is 0. Yeah, so that's basic stuff with adding and subtracting. We also can do things like multiplying. So let's say that's the multiplication operator, and this is the division operator, which is the asterisk and the slash. So once again, if we run the program, we'll get the new values. So 5 times 5 is 25, and then 5 divided by 5 is 1. So that's all our operators, arithmetic operators, besides the modulus operator. So the modulus operator is simply the remainder. So if I said, let's delete this. So int x equals 10. The modulus operator is the percent sign. So 10 mod 3. This simply says, okay, do 10 divided by 3, and then give me the remainder, and then store that remainder inside of x. So this is going to print a 1 because 3 goes into 10 3 times with 1 left over. So if we run it, the value of x is 1. So that's all the modulus operator is. It's just the remainder. So it first does the division, and then instead of returning the division, it returns the remainder and then stores that into the variable because we're using the assignment operator. So now let's talk about operator precedence a little bit. So first thing to note with operator precedence is multiplication, division, and the modulus operator always come first. So if we had something like this, int result equals 2 plus 3 times 4, you would think maybe that it does 2 plus 3 first and then times 4, but that's not the case. Multiplication has a higher precedence than addition, so this would do 3 times 4 first, which is 12, plus 2. Just to prove that, let's write line result, print this out, and you can see it's 14. So multiplication, division, and remainders take precedence. I could, however, override this by using parentheses. If I wanted to say do the addition first, I could say I could put my parentheses in around 2 plus 3, and now that will force to add first. So that would do 2 plus 3, which is 5, and then times that by 4, which is 20. If I run the program, I can see it says 20 now. So that's a little bit with operator precedence and that multiplication comes first, and division and modulus operator. But you can override it with the parentheses. Okay, so now let's talk about shortcut arithmetic operators. There are ways that we can speed up the process of adding a value to an existing variable. So let's say we have a variable called int counter and say it's equal to 5. If I asked you to increment or increase the value of counter by 1, most people wouldn't know how to do it, or most beginner programmers don't know how to do it. Most of the time programmers go like this. They say counter equals plus 1. But really, by doing counter equals plus 1, they're just saying counter equals positive 1. And they're completely reassigning whatever it was in there. They're overwriting it with 1. And the correct way to increment, let's say this variable by 1 would be is saying counter equals itself plus 1. So it would be counter equals counter plus 1. Counter equals counter plus 1 says counter equals whatever is on the right hand side. So counter plus 1 would be 5 plus 1. So this evaluates to 6. And now it's saying counter equals 6 because the assignment operator just takes whatever's on the right and assigns it to the left. So let me print this out. And you can see counter is equal to 6 now. Now, because this is used so often of incrementing a variable's value, there are a couple shortcuts to doing this. Especially there's a couple shortcuts to incrementing by 1. The first shortcut, instead of going counter equals counter plus 1, is saying counter plus equal 1. Counter plus equal 1 says, and it pretty much just takes out the step of going counter plus 1. It says add 1 to counter and then assign that value to counter. So if I delete this and run the line and run the program now, I will still see 6 because it took the value of whatever is in counter and then just added 1 to it and then stored it in counter. So that's a shortcut instead of saying counter equals counter plus 1. There's also counter minus equal. I'll say 1. Counter times equal. Let's say 2. Counter divide equal. And so on. There we have, for all the normal arithmetic operators, there's shortcut ones like this that simply take out the step of having to repeat the variable's name. This says counter plus equal 1, so it adds 1 to counter. Counter minus equal 1 minus 1's from counter. Counter times equal 2 takes whatever counter is, times it by 2, and then assigns it to counter. And then same thing with divide equal. Those all do the same thing. Okay, so now let's talk about incrementing our variable. So let's say we've int counter equals 5. If we wanted to increment it by 1, we could say counter equals counter plus 1, counter plus equal 1, or there's one more way. Because in programming, incrementing a variable by 1 is so common, there's a couple operators for just incrementing and decrementing by 1. So the first one, well, they're called increment and decrement operators. So there's a couple ways of using them, however. So for instance, the first way I could go counter plus plus. And by saying counter plus plus, that says take whatever the value of counter is and increment it by 1. So just to show you how this works, let's go ahead and display this. Let's run it. You can see it says 6 still because it took the value of counter and added 1 to it. So that's what counter plus plus does. That's the postfix way of using the increment operator, because the plus plus is coming after the variable's name. There's also a prefix way by putting the plus plus before the counter. Now, by doing it this way, they work the same exact way. I can run the program and it still says 6. Now, the where it comes into a play where it's a little bit different, the postfix and the prefix, is when we're assigning a variable. So if I said, let's go back. If I said int counter equals 5, and then int x equals counter plus plus, and I displayed what is stored in here by going, I'll display counter and x. So I'll say console.writeLine. I'll use the placeholder method. I'll say 0, 1, and I'll say counter is the first one, followed by x. So counter will be stored into the 0 placeholder, and x will be stored into the second placeholder. So what's happening with this? Because the plus plus operator is post, the assignment first, int x equals counter, that happens first before the plus plus happens. So whatever counter is, x gets. So int x equals 5, that's what would happen because counter is 5. After this line was finished, plus plus would then increment after, but that won't be assigned to x. So this would go int x equals counter plus plus, and then it would do int x equals counter plus plus. It would take 5. It would put 5 into x. It would then increment counter after that. So when we run this code, you'll see that counter is 6. Counter is 6, and x is 5. So if I run this, you'll see counter was first, that's 6, and x is 5. However, if I change this into, instead of counter plus plus to plus plus counter, now this will increment counter before it's assigned to x. So now int x will take the value of 6. So it would first increment, then assign. So x would be 6 and counter will be 6. So if I run this code, it will say 6 6. So when plus plus is first, it increments before assigning, and if plus plus is after, it would assign after. I mean, it would increment after assigning. Now, there's also a decrement operator that works the same way, but it's just minus minus, and it goes down by 1. So in this code, it would decrement counter by 1, and then assign that to x, and then counter would go down also. So counter goes down, then it assigns. So if I run this code, it says 4 4, which it should. If I change this to a postfix decrement operator, now x will take the value of 5 first, and then after this is done assigning, then it will decrease by 1. So if I run this program, you'll see that counter went down to 4, which it should have, but 5, which is x, stayed the same because it assigns first. Okay, so that's basics with the short so now let's start talking about bools and comparison operators. So a bool is another data type, but this data type can hold only true or false values. So here's a couple examples of bools. So bool, I'll say, is it Monday? And I'll say it's equal to false. And then I'll say bool, let's say, are you tired? That's equal to true. So these are our two variables names that had type bool, and they can only hold true or false. If I try to put in a number or something, you can see it's going to get an error. So those are our variables. Now, along with bools are comparison operators. Comparison operators are ways that we can compare two things, but comparison operators only evaluate to a true or false value, which then brings bools into play. So, for instance, some of the comparison operators that we have are greater than, less than, greater than equal to, less than or equal to, not equal to, and is equal to. So I'll show you how they work. So let's start off with, let's make an integer x equals 5, int y equals 6, let's say. And then, okay. So let's first mess around with the greater than comparison operator. So because comparison operators can only return a true or false value, we can store the result of them into a bool. So let's make a bool. Let's say bool, my bool, equals, let's say, x is greater than y. Now, what this is saying is, it first says, is x greater than y? It checks, is 5 greater than 6? 5 is not greater than 6, so this operator, this greater than operator, will return false, and my bool will have false. So if I print this out, console.writeLine, my bool, and run it, you'll see it says false. Whereas if I change, let's do less than. Run it, now it says true, because 5 is less than 6. So that's less than and greater than. Let's do another one. Let's do greater than or equal to. So bool, my second bool, equals x is greater than, and it's greater than or equal like that, then y. So that's my second bool, and then I'll display this to the console. let's run it. So the first one is true, and the second one is false because 5 is not greater than y. I mean, 5 is not greater than 6. Let's change this to 5 and 5 now and run it again. Now, the first one is false and the second one is true. 5 is not less than 5 because 5 is not less than 5, but 5 is greater than or equal to 5. So that's why the greater than equal one is true, because it has the equal part, because they are equal. So 5 is greater than or equal to 5 is true. Another operator, comparison operator, is the not equal. And the not equal is an exclamation point equal. So this statement, if I ran this as is, it's going to come up false because x and y are both 5, and I'm saying 5 is not equal to 5. Well, that's false because 5 is equal to 5. If I changed this back to 6 and ran it, now it would say true because the second one's true because 5 is really not equal to 5. So that's why it's true. And then lastly, we have the is equal operator. So I'm going to get rid of this one. The is equal operator is simply two equal signs. Now this is different than the assignment. The assignment operator says take the value on the right and assign it to the value on the left, but the comparison equal operator says is the value on the right equal to the value on the left. It compares them. Is x equal to y? It doesn't do any assigning, it's just checking, and it returns either true or false. Since so this is saying, is x equal to y? Well, is 5 equal to 6? No, it's not. So I'm going to get a false here. So that's where it displays false. Okay, so that's bools and the basics of comparison operators. And all these things that I'm going over right now, this is just the first lesson. When I go over more advanced lessons and we use these things, it will come easier to you and it will be a lot easier to understand. So don't worry about it now if you're not understanding. Alright, now let's start talking about casting. I mentioned it early in the lesson, but now I want to formally talk about it. Casting is the concept or idea that of forcing something that normally can't fit into something else into it. We kind of force it in. So, for example, let's say we had... Actually, let's start out with an implicit cast, or a conversion that doesn't require us to force it in. So let's start out with int my int equals 5. And let's say double my int equals, double equals my int. This doesn't throw any errors or do anything wrong because an integer can always fit inside of a double. A double can hold a very large number that includes decimal points, and an integer is only whole numbers. So, a whole number can always fit inside an integer can always fit inside of a double because doubles can hold whole numbers. Whereas if we flip these around, let's say we had, let's just rewrite it. Let's say we had double my double equals 5.5, and then int my int equals my double. This is going to error because my double can hold a decimal point value, whereas an integer can never hold a decimal point value. So it's saying I can't fit 5.5 into my integer. So if I highlight it, that's what the error says. It says can't convert type double, which is my double, into an integer. And it says, are you missing a cast? So this is where casting comes into play. I can explicitly cast or explicitly force my double, which is 5.5, into my integer. However, if I force it and squeeze my double into my integer, I'm going to lose some information because an integer still can't hold a 0.5. So instead of rounding or doing whatever kind of method, it simply just cuts it off. It cuts off the 0.5. So if I force my double into my int, it will drop the 0.5 and it will just keep the 5. So in order to cast, the syntax is going to the front of my variable that I want to cast and putting parentheses. Now inside that parentheses, I put the type that I want to cast to. Since I want to convert a double to an integer, I'm saying I want to cast to an integer. So I'm saying that this line reads as int my int is equal to the value of my double as an integer. So the value of my double as an integer would cut off the 0.5 and it would just keep the 5. So if I print out my integer into the console, you'll see that it's going to show 5. It completely cut off the 0.5. And that's a cast. I'm forcing the double into the integer. I'm squeezing in, and it cuts off the edges because it can't completely fit in. So that's what casting is. Okay. All right. Let's talk about now another data type called the character. A character is a data type that can only hold one letter or number or one symbol, or one character. Um, Characters use single quotes instead of double quotes, where strings use double quotes because they can hold multiple characters, and just a character uses single quotes. For instance, let's create characters by saying char, which is char, my char equals, and I'll say, let's put an h. So the value of h in single quotes is now stored into my character. So this is just another variable that holds just single characters. I'll make another one. Say my character, my second char equals 8. I can put a number in there, and the value of a character 8 is completely different if I said int x equals 8. An int x equal 8 has a different representation in code, I guess. I don't want to go into too far into detail. I will eventually cover it, but without confusing people too much. A character 8 is represented differently than a numeric 8 that's stored into an integer. And that's all I'm going to say for now. I will explain this a lot more in later lessons, but they're different. So yeah, so now we have a character 8, and same thing with the string 8 also. A string 8 is different than a numeric 8. So, but I can store these single things into a character. Now, that's simply what a character is. However, there are other things called escape characters. Escape characters are things that you can implant inside of strings that are characters, but they perform different actions rather than just representing a character. So for instance, the first character I want to explain is a new line character. And that is, the new line character is simply a \n. A \n represents one character, even though it's two symbols. It represents one character because it has that backslash, which is an escape character. So the \n in this single quote represents a new line. So if I were to put this new line character anywhere into a string, it would cause the string to go to the next line. So for instance, let's say I have a message into the console. Let's say console.writeLine hello world. Normally this is going to print on one line. I'll show you that it does. So it says hello world. But if I want to put hello world onto two different lines, I could write console.writeLine hello and then console.writeLine world. Instead of doing that, I could just put in an escape character. Well, more specifically, the new line escape character. So I can just put that right here and go, hello world, new line escape character world. Now the new line will thus make it hello world to be split onto two different lines. Now you can see it goes hello world on different lines. There's also another common, so that's a new line escape character. There's also uh, a horizontal tab escape character, and that's a \t. So I'm going to add a \t here instead of the \n, and now when I run the program, this will do a horizontal tab. Hello tab world now. I could also put in the \n if I wanted and stack them up. So now it's hello new line, then tab world. So those are two escape characters. I'll go over a couple more. Let's say, for instance, we wanted to write hello world, but we wanted to in the console, we want to display the double quotes. If I just try to put double quotes in here like this, around there, around each side, it's going to error because it's cutting off the string. I'm making two different strings here rather than adding double quotes. It's completing the series of double quotes, which is needed for the literal string for me to represent it in this console. So in order to do that, we have to use escape characters. So because escape characters ignore what comes after the backslash, or I mean it gets ignored by the string. So if I wanted to actually put in the physical double quotes, I would do a \, then double quotes there, followed by the \, double quotes here. So now when I run the code, now in the console, it actually has the physical quotes. Same thing if I wanted to do single quotes, like this, and then run this again. Now you can see the hello world has single quotes. And another one like this is if I want to actually put a \, in. Because if I wanted to just display a \, and I did it like this, those two \s are escape characters, so it doesn't work. But if I wanted to actually display a physical \, I would have to put in two \. And now if I ran it, now you can see that the physical \ is there. So those are escape characters. All right, now let's start talking about strings. I created a string variable when I first started the lesson, but now I want to more formally go over them a little bit more. So let's create another string saying string my name equals Frank in that double quotes, which shows that it's a literal string. And I want to first do a couple things. I want to show you one thing that a string has that's kind of cool is a length property. Now, the length property, once we talk about classes and structs and stuff like that, we'll talk about properties and functions more formally. But a property is simply just characteristics or ways to store information in a class or a struct that contains information about that. So the string has a built-in length property that is an integer. It's an integer that represents how many characters are stored in the string. So if I want to get to that length, I can say my name.length, and this will tell me the length of how many characters are in this string. I could store this into an integer array, an integer variable, and then print that into the console, or I could just write this to the console itself and just put this in the parentheses like that, display this, and you'll see that it says a 5 because there's 5 characters in that string variable. Like I said also before though, I could simply just put this into like a variable, say length like this, and say it's equal to my name.length, because length is an integer. If I highlight over it, you can see it says int string.length. So that means it is an integer. So I can store that into an integer. So now I can just say, instead of going like that, I can say console.writeLine length. Like that, and once again, it will print 5, as you can see. So that's a little bit with strings. Now I want to stay with strings a little bit and start talking about reading input from the console. Now, the first thing to note when you're reading input from the console is that input comes to you as a string. So when we read in, it's always being read in as a string. So to read in from the console, we use the console.readLine function by doing console.readLine, semicolon, because it's a statement. The parentheses show that it's a function, and that it performs an action, which is reading in. And yeah, I'm not gonna talk about that yet. So we have console.readLine. Now, if we want to store what is read in from the console into a variable, we have to store it into a variable. But it always comes in as a string, so I'll start with the string. So let's say string my name, because I'm going to ask it to print in a name or read in a name, equals console.readLine. So now whatever it does console.readLine, it gets a value, whatever is typed in, and then stores that into my name. So to make this a more practical program, let's add a console.writeLine statement that says enter your name. So let's say please enter your first name. So we say, please enter your first name. Then it says string my name equals console.readLine. So the program will hold up here until something is entered into the read line, entered into the console, and then they hit enter, and then that value will be stored into my name. So then, after I store their value into my name, I'm going to reprint it saying hello, that name, using the placeholder method. So then I'm going to say console.writeLine hello placeholder. So that's where their name's going to go. And then my name, because my name is going to have the value followed by the parentheses and the semicolon, because my name is going to have the value of whatever is typed in through console.readLine. So now that if I run this program, you can see it waits. It says, please enter your first name. So I'll say Frank here. I'll hit enter. And now it says, hello, Frank. It knows when it says, hello, Frank, it knows that it's Frank because I stored that into my name. And then it keeps it in memory. Yeah, it keeps it in memory, and then I can print it out. Yeah, so that's reading in from the console, and then printing out what we read in after we store it into a variable. But I want to now, let's say I wanted to read in an integer. If I left it like this and ran the program and typed in a 1, everything's fine. It says hello 1. But the problem with that is, let's say if we wanted to build some kind of application. Let's say we wanted to make an application that asks the user to enter a number, and then we add 5 to it, and then print whatever the number is plus 5. If we keep it like this, let me change this. Please enter a number. If I keep it like this and say string, let's say my number equals console.writeLine, it will take in the number that you're writing, but it's going to take it in as a string. And if we take it in as a string, we can't use it in mathematical equations, like using the arithmetic operator for addition and subtraction. So in order for us to do that, we have to cast or convert the string to an integer so we can use it for mathematical equations. Now there's a couple ways we can do that. The first way we could do that is instead of doing this, so let's start over. Let's say we have, because we know they're going to be entering in a number, so let's create an integer variable that will hold that number. So we'll say int my number equals, we'll first write console.readline. This is going to throw an error. Now, this is throwing an error because console.readline gets read in as a string. And since we're storing that into an integer, it doesn't know how to store a string as an integer by itself. We need to tell it how to do that. And there's a couple ways of doing this, like I said, but how I like to use it, I use the parse function. The parse function of the integer struct. Which is this. The integer data type has a parse function built in. And the parse function simply just takes in a string and converts it to whatever you want. So if I go, I'll delete this. If I go int.parse, then inside the parentheses I supply it the string, which is console.readline. That console.readline, this evaluates to a string. So if I say int.parse and then surround those parentheses in this string console.readline followed by a semicolon, this takes whatever I entered in as a string, converts it to an integer, and then stores that integer into my number. So now I can use that for mathematical equations. So now if I wanted to say int number, or I'll say int new number, and this is going to be equal to my number plus 5. And then I'm going to display this back to the console and say, let's do a placeholder. Let's say so the first placeholder is going to be the number that they entered. I'm going to say plus 5 as a string, and then I'm going to say equals a second placeholder. So the first placeholder is going to be equal to my number, whatever they typed in. The second one will be equal to new number. That's whatever plus 5 is. So this is all a string. So I'm saying the first placeholder, which is my number, plus 5 equals the new number. And I know it's plus 5 because I coded it plus 5 here, so this all works. So let's run it. So it says, please enter a number. I'll say 10, enter, and then it says 10 plus 5 equals 15. Now, this is the beginning of building a simple calculator. So we should go ahead and just build it anyway and finish it off. So let's ask the user. So let's delete this part. So once we store in the first number that the user enters, let's ask the user to enter a second number. And we'll say console.readline, please enter a second number. And then we'll say int my second number equals int.parse to convert the incoming string that comes in console.readline. And then, so this has the function, so this shows it's a function, then in the parentheses matches up with the parse function, and then a semicolon. So now we have our second number stored as an integer in a variable. Now we're going to say, okay, let's make a simple addition calculator. We'll say int answer equals my number plus my second number. So now our answer is holding the value that's equal to our two numbers added together. And now I'm just going to write to the console.writeLine, we'll use placeholders. So we'll say the first number entered plus the second number entered equals our answer. So our first number is my number, the second number is my second number, and then our answer is answer. So my number gets replaced into the first placeholder, my second number gets placed into the second placeholder, and my third number, which is answer, gets placed into the third placeholder. Let's run the program. So it says enter a number, I'll say 10. It says please enter a second number, I'll say 15. And now the answer is 10 plus 15 equals 25. So everything works out. So this is the code to build a simple calculator application. Alright, so that's going to be it for this first lesson on working with data.